December 16, 1944. Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The frozen earth cracked beneath boots that had marched too far, fought too long, and believed too deeply in their own inevitable advance. Lieutenant James Brennan of the 99th Infantry Division stood at the edge of a snow-laden ridge, watching German artillery transform the dawn into a cathedral of fire and iron. This was not the war they had been promised, the clean, mechanical sweep across a broken enemy. This was something older, something that recognized no difference between victor and vanquished when winter and mathematics aligned against hope. Behind him, 300 men prepared to assault a fortified Belgian farmhouse that intelligence claimed held 30 defenders. The math seemed simple, 10-1. American industrial might against a dying Reich. But Brennan had learned, in the brutal algebra of the Hurtgen Forest, that numbers meant nothing when terrain loved one side more than the other. The farmhouse sat atop a hill, its stone walls thick as contempt, its fields of fire overlapping like the fingers of a closing fist. His commander's orders were clear: frontal assault at 0800 hours. Brennan looked at his map and saw only corpses. The American war machine of 1944 operated on a philosophy of overwhelming force, a doctrine born in the factories of Detroit and the steel mills of Pittsburgh, refined in the deserts of North Africa and the bocage of Normandy. By December, the Allied command believed the Wehrmacht was finished. Intelligence reports spoke of depleted divisions, boys and old men pressed into service, Tiger tanks without fuel sitting like monuments to a dead ambition. The American soldier carried this confidence in his K-rations and his M1 Garand, in the endless columns of trucks that brought ammunition forward and the fighter bombers that owned the sky. Captain Robert Hendricks embodied this certainty. A West Point graduate who had studied Patton's sweep across France like scripture, he saw war as a problem of logistics and will. 300 rifles against 30, he told his officers the night before. We go straight up the middle. Speed and shock. They'll break or they'll die. He pointed at aerial reconnaissance photos showing the farmhouse. Stone, 2 stories, slate roof partially collapsed, fields sloping away on 3 sides, a tree line to the east. No complexity here, gentlemen. Just execute. But Lieutenant Brennan, 24 years old with a degree in civil engineering from Ohio State, studied those same photographs differently. He saw angles of fire, dead space, the mathematical relationship between cover and exposure. The frontal approach offered nothing. 600 yards of open snow rising toward prepared positions. Every weapons manual, every tactical doctrine emphasized the same principle: never assault fortified positions uphill without suppressing fire or maneuver advantage. Sir, Brennan had said, what about the tree line? If we split the force? Lieutenant, I didn't ask for alternatives. Hendricks had fought through Sicily and crossed the Rhine in his imagination 1,000 times. The German army is finished. What we're facing here are remnants, ghosts. You hit them hard enough and they vanish. Around them, the rest of the battalion prepared with mechanical efficiency. Ammunition distributed, 8 clips per rifleman, 6 grenades per squad. Medics checked supplies. Radio operators tested frequencies. The machinery of American war hummed with confidence born of 2 years' victories. But in the frozen darkness, Brennan traced his finger along that eastern tree line on his map, calculating distances, angles, time. The math kept telling him the same thing. Frontal assault meant slaughter. At 0730 hours, the German machine guns opened fire on a reconnaissance patrol, a brief, precise demonstration of overlapping fields that shredded 3 men in seconds. The sound echoed through the forest like an iron bell. 2 MG-42s, firing from reinforced positions with interlocking coverage. The wounded crawled back through snow that turned pink, then red, their screams absorbed by the vast indifference of winter and war. Captain Hendricks watched through binoculars, his jaw tight. Effective rate of fire, 1,200 rounds per minute per gun, he said, as if naming the thing would diminish it. Doesn't matter. We have 300 men. They have 30. Math doesn't lie. But Brennan had seen this mathematics before. In the Hurtgen, where American divisions had been ground into fragments against positions just like this, where the forest had loved the defender and despised the attacker, where every clearing became a killing ground and trees burst into splinters that blinded and shredded. He remembered finding a prayer book in a dead German soldier's pocket, remembered the careful handwriting, the pressed flower between pages. The enemy was never the caricature that propaganda painted, never the desperate rabble that intelligence promised. He approached Hendricks one final time. "Sir, the eastern approach. It's covered by trees for 400 yards. We could move one platoon through there, hit their flank while the main force pins them from the front. Divide their fire, create confusion. That tree line is 800 yards from our position," Hendricks interrupted. "You'd be out of communication, unsupported. If you get pinned down, I can't help you. And it pulls men away from the main assault, weakens our breakthrough force. Sir, there won't be a breakthrough. Not up that hill. Not against prepared positions with overlapping fire. We'll lose half the company in the first 100 yards. Hendricks turned to face him fully. The captain's eyes held that peculiar certainty that comes from believing victory is destiny, that the moral superiority of cause translates to battlefield invincibility. "Lieutenant, your job is to execute orders, not redesign strategy. We attack at 0800. Frontal assault. That's final." Brennan saluted, walked back to his platoon, checked his watch. 22 minutes. He made his decision in 18. The math kept telling him the same thing. Frontal assault meant slaughter. Development 2, 398 words. At 0730 hours, the German machine guns opened fire on a reconnaissance patrol. A brief, precise demonstration of overlapping fields that shredded 3 men in seconds. The sound echoed through the forest like an iron bell. 2 MG-42s firing from reinforced positions with interlocking coverage. The wounded crawled back through snow that turned pink, then red, their screams absorbed by the vast indifference of winter and war. Captain Hendricks watched through binoculars, his jaw tight. "Effective rate of fire, 1,200 rounds per minute per gun," he said, as if naming the thing would diminish it. "Doesn't matter. We have 300 men. They have 30. Math doesn't lie." But Brennan had seen this mathematics before. In the Hurtgen, where American divisions had been ground into fragments against positions just like this, where the forest had loved the defender and despised the attacker, where every clearing became a killing ground, and trees burst into splinters that blinded and shredded. He remembered finding a prayer book in a dead German soldier's pocket, remembered the careful handwriting, the pressed flower between pages. The enemy was never the caricature that propaganda painted, never the desperate rabble that intelligence promised. He approached Hendricks one final time. "Sir, the eastern approach, it's covered by trees for 400 yards. We could move one platoon through there, hit their flank while the main force pins them from the front. Divide their fire, create confusion. That tree line is 800 yards from our position," Hendricks interrupted. "You'd be out of communication, unsupported. If you get pinned down, I can't help you. And it pulls men away from the main assault, weakens our breakthrough force. Sir, there won't be a breakthrough. Not up that hill. Not against prepared positions with overlapping fire. We'll lose half the company in the first 100 yards. Hendricks turned to face him fully. The captain's eyes held that peculiar certainty that comes from believing victory is destiny, that the moral superiority of cause translates to battlefield invincibility. "Lieutenant, your job is to execute orders, not redesign strategy. We attack at 0800. Frontal assault. That's final." Brennan saluted, walked back to his platoon, checked his watch. 22 minutes. He made his decision in 18. Development 3, 401 words. What Lieutenant Brennan did next would be called insubordination by some, initiative by others, and that stupid flank by Captain Hendricks for the rest of his life. At 0755 hours, 5 minutes before the scheduled assault, Brennan assembled his 42-man platoon in the forest shadow. "We're taking the eastern route," he said simply, "through the trees, around their flank. When you hear the main assault begin, we move fast and we move quiet. Questions?" Sergeant Daniel O'Connor, a Boston ironworker who had survived Omaha Beach, looked at his lieutenant with something between respect and concern. "Sir, the captain know about this?" "The captain gave me discretion for tactical positioning," Brennan lied smoothly. The men recognized the lie, understood its necessity, accepted it with the grim pragmatism of soldiers who trusted their lieutenant more than their captain's certainty. They had seen Brennan's caution keep them alive in the Hurtgen. They had watched other platoons follow bold orders into oblivion. They moved into the tree line as the main force began its assault, 300 men rising from positions and advancing uphill through snow that clutched at their boots like cold hands. The German guns opened immediately. The distinctive sound of MG-42s, that terrible ripping noise that earned them the nickname Hitler's buzzsaw. Tracers drew geometric patterns across the white hillside. Men fell in clusters, in ones and twos, their bodies dark against snow that had been pristine seconds before. Brennan's platoon moved through the forest in a tactical column, spacing maintained, weapons ready. The trees here were thick, pine and fir that had survived centuries, their branches heavy with snow that muffled sound and obscured vision. Every 50 yards, Brennan checked his compass, calculated distance, listened to the battle raging 800 yards west. The sound was worse than seeing it. The machine guns, the screams, the desperate crackling of American rifles firing uphill at prepared positions. 400 yards. 500. The tree line curved around the base of the hill, exactly as the aerial photographs had shown. Through gaps in the forest, Brennan caught glimpses of the farmhouse's eastern wall. Stone, unfortified, with only 2 small windows. No machine gun positions on this side. All their fire directed west toward the main assault. The Germans had made the same mistake every defender makes. They had prepared for the attack they expected, not the attack that was coming. At 8:23 hours, Brennan's platoon reached their assault position, a small depression in the forest floor, 200 yards from the farmhouse's eastern wall. Through the trees they could see the battle's reality. American soldiers pinned down in the snow, using their dead as cover. The advance completely stalled. Captain Hendrix's voice crackled over the radio, ordering another push, demanding momentum that courage alone could not create. Men were dying at the intersection of hope and mathematics. Brennan gathered his squad leaders. "We go in 3 elements," he said, sketching in the snow with his knife. "First squad suppresses those windows. Second and third squads breach the east wall. Fast and violent. The moment we're inside, their whole defensive position collapses. They can't defend 2 directions simultaneously." Corporal James Mitchell, a farmer from Iowa who had never fired a weapon in anger before France, asked the question they all felt. What if we can't break through? What if there's more inside than we think? It was the uncertainty that lived in every soldier's chest. The fear not of death itself, but of dying meaninglessly, of brave actions that changed nothing. Brennan met Mitchell's eyes. Then the main assault fails, and 300 men die on that hill for nothing. We're already committed. The only direction is forward. He was 24 years old, carrying responsibility for 42 lives and the weight of a decision that contradicted every order he had received. In that moment, Brennan understood something that West Point never taught, that no manual covered. Warfare was not the execution of perfect plans by confident commanders, but rather the desperate improvisation of young men trying to prevent slaughter with whatever tools and terrain they possessed. The psychology of that moment, the acceptance of risk, the burden of choice, the loneliness of command, would mark him forever. Years later, he would wake from dreams of this forest, this snow, these 42 faces watching him and trusting that his mathematics were better than his captain's certainty. "First squad on my mark," he said quietly. "Everyone else, when you hear our fire, you sprint. Don't think, don't hesitate. Speed is armor now." He looked at his watch. 8:25 hours. Checked his rifle. 8 rounds, 1 chambered. Said a prayer to a god he had stopped believing in somewhere in the Hurtgen forest. Gave the order. The assault lasted 4 minutes, an eternity compressed into frantic motion and controlled chaos. First squad's rifles cracked in disciplined volleys, their rounds shattering the eastern windows and forcing anyone inside away from that wall. Then Brennan's main element erupted from the tree line, 40 men running across 200 yards of open ground, while German attention remained fixed westward on the main assault they had prepared for, expected, and were systematically destroying. The Wehrmacht defenders were not the exhausted remnants that Allied intelligence had promised. They were veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had learned warfare in the apocalyptic classrooms of Stalingrad and Kursk, who understood that survival meant preparation, discipline, and the ruthless exploitation of defensive advantage. But they had committed the tactical sin of focusing entirely on the threat they could see, assuming that American doctrine would never permit a flanking maneuver that pulled forces away from the main assault. Brennan hit the eastern wall with his lead element and immediately discovered that stone walls built by Belgian farmers in the 1700s could not stop determined men with grenades and desperation. The first explosion blew a hole 3 feet wide. The second widened it. By the third, Brennan's squad was pouring through into chaos, a dark interior where American and German soldiers collided in close-quarters confusion. What happened next entered the platoon's collective memory as a blur of muzzle flashes in darkness, of men fighting room to room with rifles, bayonets, entrenching tools, anything that could kill. The Germans tried to reorient, tried to split their forces between 2 threats, but the mathematics that had favored defense became the arithmetic of collapse. Soldiers cannot aim machine guns in two directions simultaneously. Positions prepared for frontal assault become death traps when attacked from behind. A young German lieutenant, no older than Brennan, with the same exhausted eyes of a man carrying too much responsibility, attempted to organize a defense of the ground floor. The two officers saw each other across a smoke-filled room, recognized in each other the mirror image of duty and desperation, and fired simultaneously. Brennan's round struck stone. The Germans jammed, a mechanical failure in the cold, the betrayal of steel when men needed it most. The German raised his hands. Behind him, his soldiers did the same. The battle for the farmhouse ended, not with heroic finality, but with pragmatic surrender. Captain Hendricks entered the farmhouse at 08:47 hours after Brennan's platoon had already secured it and signaled the all-clear. The captain's face carried the complex expression of a man confronting the gap between his certainty and reality's indifference, relief that the position was taken, fury that it had not happened according to his design, and the deep, unspoken dread of counting casualties from an assault that need not have been so costly. 53 American soldiers lay dead or dying on the western slope, another 78 wounded, some who would lose limbs to frostbite and shrapnel, others who would carry invisible wounds that 1944 had no name for. The butcher's bill for a frontal assault against prepared positions, exactly as every tactical manual predicted, exactly as Brennan's mathematics had warned. Brennan's platoon had lost 4 men, 2 killed instantly breaching the wall, 2 who would die of wounds before the medics could stop the bleeding. 4 names that would join the 60 million dead in a war that was supposed to have ended months ago. The captured Germans, 26 survivors of a 30-man garrison, sat against the farmhouse's western wall, hands bound, faces carrying the exhaustion of men who had fought too long on the losing side of history. Their young lieutenant, the one whose rifle had jammed, watched Brennan with eyes that held neither hatred nor gratitude, only the numb recognition of shared survival. "You disobeyed a direct order," Hendricks said quietly, standing beside Brennan in the farmhouse's ruined kitchen. Snow fell through the collapsed roof. Somewhere outside, medics worked with morphine and prayer. "Yes, sir. Your flank attack succeeded only because you got lucky. If they had positioned even one gun covering that eastern approach." "They didn't, sir, because I studied the terrain and calculated probabilities instead of assuming victory." The words hung between them, edged with insubordination and truth. Hendricks was a captain who had graduated West Point with honors, who had studied under men who had studied under Pershing. Brennan was a lieutenant with an engineering degree who trusted mathematics more than doctrine. "I should court-martial you," Hendricks said. "Yes, sir. But then I would have to explain to battalion why our frontal assault cost 53 dead for a position that fell to 42 men, attacking from an unsupported flank." They stood in silence, listening to the war continue around them. The truth about Brennan's stupid flank spread through the 99th Infantry Division faster than official reports could sanitize it. Soldiers traded the story in foxholes and aid stations, embellishing and distilling until it became something between legend and lesson. The lieutenant who saved 300 men by ignoring his captain's certainty. By the time it reached battalion headquarters, the story had acquired the weight of parable, a reminder that in war, terrain and enemy capability matter more than confidence and doctrine. Major General Walter Lauer, commanding the 99th, called Brennan to Division HQ 3 days after the assault. The general was a veteran of World War I who had seen an entire generation ground into the mud of the Western Front because commanders confused courage with strategy. He studied Brennan across a desk made from a repurposed door. Maps of the Ardennes spread between them like accusations. "Captain Hendricks recommended you for court-martial," Lauer said without preamble. "Insubordination, failure to follow orders, unauthorized deviation from approved assault plan." Brennan stood at attention, saying nothing. In 3 days, the 99th had been hammered by the opening waves of Germany's Ardennes offensive, what would later be called the Battle of the Bulge. The Wehrmacht's surprise attack had shattered American lines, sent entire divisions reeling backward, and proved that intelligence reports of enemy exhaustion were catastrophically wrong. The certainty that the war was won had collided with winter and desperation, and the last gamble of a dying Reich. "Captain Hendricks also recommended you for the Silver Star," Lauer continued, "for initiative, tactical flexibility, and leadership under fire." The general's eyes held something like grim amusement. "Apparently you can be both insubordinate and heroic simultaneously. I'm told that's an engineer's specialty." ignoring everyone while being technically correct. "Sir, You calculated odds, trusted your analysis over your commander's confidence, and made a decision that saved lives. In a better army, that would be called good officership." Lauer leaned back. "In our army, it's called problematic initiative. You understand the distinction?" "Yes, sir." "Good, because I'm promoting you to captain and giving you a company. The Germans are coming, Lieutenant. Sorry, Captain. And I need officers who think instead of just obeying. We're going to need a lot of stupid flanks in the next few weeks." The German offensive that became the Battle of the Bulge was Hitler's final throw of the dice, a massive assault designed to split Allied armies, capture the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the West. It was a plan born of desperation masquerading as audacity, executed by an army that could still demonstrate tactical excellence even as strategic collapse loomed. The 99th Infantry Division found itself directly in the path of the 6th SS Panzer Army's main thrust. Captain James Brennan, newly promoted and commanding Baker Company, deployed his men along a ridgeline east of Elsenborn with the same methodical precision that had saved them at the farmhouse. But this time, there would be no flanking maneuvers, no clever mathematics to solve the problem. This time, mathematics meant holding terrain against impossible odds, while the rest of the American line reorganized behind them. Intelligence estimates suggested they faced a regiment. The reality was closer to a division. Tanks, infantry, and artillery that turned the frozen Belgian forest into a tableau of industrial violence. The 99th Division became speed bumps wearing American uniforms, fighting delaying actions that traded ground for time, accepting casualties as the price of slowing down an offensive that could have shattered the entire Allied position. Brennan's company held their sector for 3 days, 72 hours of artillery barrages that turned trees into splinters and men into memories, of tank attacks that his infantry stopped with bazookas and desperation, of German infantry assaults that broke against American defensive fire like waves against rocks. He used every lesson from the farmhouse, studied terrain, calculated firing positions, trusted his sergeants, and never assumed that doctrine would save them. On the 3rd day, with his company reduced to 90 men from the original 180, Division ordered withdrawal to secondary positions. They pulled back in good order, carrying their wounded, leaving their dead with promises to return. The mathematics of defense had worked differently than the mathematics of assault, slower, more attritional, paid in fatigue and frostbite, and the gradual erosion of everything except the will to hold. Behind them, the German advance had been delayed by crucial hours. Other American units had used those hours to establish the defensive line that would hold at Elsenborn Ridge, that would blunt the 6th SS Panzer Army's thrust, and begin the long grind that would turn Hitler's gamble into Germany's final defeat. By January 1945, the Bulge had been contained and then reversed. The Wehrmacht's offensive, launched with such hope and fury, collapsed under the weight of its own logistical impossibility. Tanks ran out of fuel. Artillery ran out of shells. Soldiers ran out of everything except orders to hold positions that could not be held. The American army, bloodied but learning, pushed back with the methodical efficiency of an industrial democracy that could replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. Captain Brennan commanded Baker Company through the counteroffensive, with the reputation of an officer who thought carefully and spent lives reluctantly. His company became known as the Flank Boys, a nickname that started as mockery from more conventional commanders but evolved into recognition. When other units bogged down in frontal assaults, Brennan found the approach that terrain and enemy disposition permitted. He studied maps like engineering problems, calculated angles and distances, trusted mathematics over momentum. He was not always successful. At a village whose name he would never remember, he misjudged German strength and lost an entire platoon in an ambush. The guilt of that miscalculation joined the guilt of every commander who sends young men into situations where mathematics offers odds, but not guarantees. He learned to live with the weight the same way he learned to function on 4 hours of sleep and trust soldiers whose names he barely knew. In late January, Division assigned Brennan to train newly arrived officers on tactical flexibility and initiative. The irony was not lost on him. The lieutenant who had been threatened with court-martial for disobedience now teaching others when to ignore doctrine. He stood before classrooms of young officers, men fresh from stateside training who still believed in clean solutions and heroic certainty, and tried to explain the gap between theory and terrain. Doctrine is a tool, not a religion, he told them. Your job is to accomplish the mission with minimum casualties. Sometimes that means following the plan. Sometimes it means recognizing that the plan is going to get everyone killed and finding another way. He paused, remembering a frozen morning outside a Belgian farmhouse. The hard part is accepting the responsibility for being wrong, because if your improvisation fails, men die. But if you blindly follow bad orders, men also die. Choose which burden you can carry. The officers nodded, taking notes, confident that they would know the difference when the moment came. Brennan envied their certainty. March 1945, the Rhine River crossing, the final barrier between the Allied armies and Germany's heartland. Baker Company had been selected for the assault wave, a recognition of their effectiveness and an acknowledgement that the most dangerous tasks fell to those who had proven they could survive them. Brennan studied the intelligence briefings with the cynicism of experience. Enemy strength, moderate, resistance, likely light, defensive positions, undermanned. He had heard these assessments before, had seen them disproven by reality too many times to trust them now. The crossing began at 200 hours under artillery cover that turned the night into flickering daylight. Baker Company crossed in storm boats, small craft that offered speed instead of protection, that trusted momentum over armor. The Rhine was dark and fast, swollen with spring melt, indifferent to the men who tried to cross it and the men who tried to stop them. German artillery found them mid-river, pre-registered firing positions that turned the water into geysers and boats into splinters. Brennan's boat took a near miss that swamped them and sent 3 men into water so cold it killed faster than shrapnel. He surfaced, gasping, pulled a private toward the eastern shore while machine gun fire stitched patterns across the river's surface. The mathematical precision of German defensive doctrine meeting the brute force of American industrial assault. They reached the eastern shore with 60% of the company intact. Better than many units, worse than the optimistic intelligence had promised. Brennan organized the survivors by instinct now, the mechanics of command so ingrained that conscious thought was unnecessary. Establish perimeter, account for casualties, identify enemy positions, calculate approach. The German defenders were Volkssturm, old men and boys pressed into service as the Reich's manpower collapsed. They fought with the courage of desperation and the skill of inadequate training. Some positions resisted with fanatical determination. Others surrendered at the first opportunity, grateful for survival. The Wehrmacht's Eastern Front veterans, the professional soldiers who might have made the defense effective, were dead or fighting the Soviets in the apocalyptic battles around Berlin. By Ordo 600 hours, Baker Company had secured its objective, a small village whose name would be forgotten, whose strategic importance lasted only hours before being absorbed into the larger offensive. They had crossed the Rhine. The industrial heartland of Nazi Germany lay open before them. The war that had consumed continents was entering its final chapter. April 1945. Germany collapsed not in heroic last stands but in administrative dissolution. Armies surrendering en masse, cities declaring themselves open, refugees clogging roads in all directions fleeing both the Western Allies and the Soviet advance from the East. The thousand-year Reich was dying in weeks, its mythology insufficient against the reality of three-front war and exhausted resources. Baker Company advanced through Bavaria, encountering resistance that varied wildly. Fanatic SS units that fought to annihilation, Wehrmacht regulars who surrendered at first contact, entire villages that hung white sheets from windows and hoped for mercy. The moral landscape of defeat was more complex than the moral clarity of invasion. Brennan's company liberated a labor camp, saw the evidence of systematic atrocity, and grappled with the realization that the enemy they had been fighting was even more monstrous than propaganda had claimed. The discovery changed something fundamental in the mathematics of war. It was no longer possible to view the conflict through the lens of tactical problems and strategic objectives. The camps, Dachau, Buchenwald, names that would echo through history, provided retrospective justification for every bullet fired and every life spent. But they also complicated the simple arithmetic of victory. The soldiers who had fought with courage for an evil cause were still courageous. The civilians who had looked away were still complicit. The liberation came too late for millions. Brennan stood outside Dachau on April 29th, watching medics try to save people who were more dead than alive, and understood that the war he had fought was a smaller war inside a larger obscenity. His flanking maneuver at the Belgian farmhouse, his defense at Elsenborn Ridge, his crossing of the Rhine. These were tactical victories in a strategic necessity, but they existed in the shadow of genocide. One of his sergeants, Daniel O'Connor, the Boston ironworker who had questioned the stupid flank 9 months earlier, stood beside him. "Sir, what do we tell people? After this, how do we explain what we saw?" Brennan had no answer. The mathematics that had guided him through battle offered no calculation for moral reckoning. "We tell them the truth," he said finally. "We tell them what happens when nations choose certainty over conscience, and we hope they believe us." 5 days later, Germany surrendered. May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. Baker Company stood formation in a German town square, listening to announcement of unconditional surrender broadcast over military radio. Around them, the physical evidence of total war, shattered buildings, displaced populations, an economy in ruins, a society that would need to be rebuilt from ethical foundations upward. The soldiers who had fought across France, Belgium, and Germany received the news with exhausted relief rather than celebration. They had survived. That was enough. Captain James Brennan, 25 years old and aged beyond years, understood that the war's end marked not closure but transition. The lieutenant who had made a flanking maneuver against orders had become a captain who understood that moral courage was more complex than tactical boldness. The certainty he had questioned in Captain Hendricks now lived in himself, the confidence that experience brought, tempered by the knowledge of how much experience cost. The revelation was not dramatic but cumulative. Warfare was not a problem that superior tactics could solve, but a failure that superior wisdom might prevent. Every battle he had won, every life he had saved through clever maneuvering, existed in the context of a conflict that should never have occurred. The German lieutenant whose rifle had jammed, the Volkssturm defenders at the Rhine, the SS fanatics who fought to the end, all were participants in a system that channeled human courage into mechanized slaughter. But within that larger tragedy, smaller truths remained. The 42 men who had trusted his judgment at the Belgian farmhouse and survived because of it. The officers he had trained who learned to question doctrine when doctrine meant death. The incremental mathematics of reducing casualties, of bringing more soldiers home than other commanders managed. These were not victories against war itself, but victories within war's terrible constraints. The Army would award him the Silver Star, the Bronze Star with V device, the Purple Heart for wounds he barely remembered receiving. The medals were bureaucratic recognition of tactical effectiveness. But the real measure lived in the letters he would receive over decades, from soldiers who served under him, from families of men who came home, from officers who learned that rigid adherence to doctrine was itself a form of cowardice. The stupid flank had worked not because it was brilliant, but because it recognized reality instead of imposing preconception. That lesson, Brennan realized, applied to more than just warfare. Captain James Brennan returned to Ohio in the summer of 1945, carrying discharge papers and memories that would shape the rest of his life. He finished his engineering degree on the GI Bill, married, raised children, and built bridges, literal ones, steel and concrete spanning rivers with mathematical precision. He rarely spoke about the war except when other veterans gathered, when shared experience created safe space for acknowledging what they had seen and done. The stupid flank entered military doctrine quietly, never as dramatic case study but as subtle influence. Training manuals in the 1950s began emphasizing tactical flexibility. Officer education programs incorporated scenarios where optimal solutions contradicted superiors' orders. The Army, slowly and institutionally, learned what Brennan had calculated in a frozen Belgian forest. That battlefield success required thinking as well as courage, judgment as well as obedience. Captain Hendricks, the West Point graduate who had ordered the frontal assault, also returned home. He taught military history at a small college, writing articles about leadership that acknowledged the complexity of command decisions. In 1963, he attended a veterans reunion, where he encountered Brennan for the first time since 1945. The two men shook hands, shared whiskey, and spoke carefully around the events of December 16, 1944. What needed to be said had been said by silence and survival. The farmhouse in Belgium still stands, its eastern wall patched but bearing scars. Local historians know the story: the American lieutenant who saved his company by ignoring orders, the German defenders who fought professionally for an evil cause, the mathematics of terrain and courage that determined who lived and who died on a winter morning when certainty collided with reality. Brennan died in 1998, an old man who had lived long enough to see his grandchildren graduate college, to watch warfare evolve into precision weapons and satellite intelligence, to hope that each generation learned enough to fight fewer wars than the last. His obituary mentioned his Silver Star and his career as an engineer, but devoted most space to his family and community service. The 42 men who followed him through that tree line remembered differently. They remembered the lieutenant who calculated odds, trusted terrain over doctrine, and brought them home when bolder commanders would have spent their lives purchasing glory. They remembered the stupid flank that wasn't stupid at all, just the quiet courage of thinking clearly when certainty demanded otherwise.